Let's find out more about this frightening threat from this evening and speak to Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, former senior naval officer in the US Navy, now a director at Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Good to have you with us. What do we know about these subs and where they might be?
Well, thank you for having me, Lucy. And there is some uncertainty here. Donald Trump did not have specificity in his Truth Social post, in the sense that we don't know if it's a ballistic missile submarine, which has Trident ballistic missiles, a guided missile submarine, which has hundreds plus of Tomahawk, or just a conventional nuclear submarine that has torpedoes and a small number of Tomahawks. If you assume it's the one that would be part of a nuclear bluster, then that would be a ballistic missile submarine. And the previous speaker is right in the sense that they're already at sea. Moving them around has a marginal advantage, but it is very unusual to have a U.S. president, practice nuclear rhetoric in public.
Where do you think they could be at the moment, though? Like, if they're up in the Arctic, is that busy there when it comes to what the Russians have got in the water too?
So certainly, historically, the Russians would say that their nuclear patrols are in the Arctic region. Ours can be, with the range of these missiles, they can be almost anywhere. Just the home ports of these ships are in Georgia and Washington State, so they could go anywhere from there, but they don't have to go far. And so really repositioning them has no tactical advantage. It's more signaling, and this is very aggressive signaling for an American president.
But is there a risk here, Admiral, of some kind of miscalculation?
The only risk is if this continues to escalate in this bluster and each one puts their nuclear forces on higher alert. There was no indication of that. We have moved nuclear submarines in the past, or announced nuclear movements, usually associated with North Korea, and some kind of signaling of strength to South Korea and support to South Korea, and provocation or an indication of a willingness to take action against North Korea. But in those cases, and in this case, there's been no actual raising of the defense readiness condition, the kind of DEFCON that would tell you that we're going to a different level. This is more rhetoric and bluster and less tactical advantage.
And Admiral, why do you think he's done this now? Is it directly in response to Dmitry Medvedev and the spat that they're having on social media?
I do think so. I think Medvedev's being annoying. I don't think the president's ready to do what he should be doing next, which are the sanctions on the shadow fleet that would bring real pressure on Putin, or the transfer of offensive weapon systems to Ukraine that would bring real pressure on Vladimir Putin. He said there's about another 5 or 6 days left till he makes that decision. So I think this is really in response to Medvedev being an irritant and annoying, and the president being able to put on Truth Social whatever he wants.
Luke, it felt a bit scary, though, when the news first came out. Do we know how young people in particular feel when they hear the words nuclear, when they think about a nuclear threat?
Well, what we know is that overall, the public think the world is becoming a more dangerous place. That's very clear in the polling. If you ask people to describe the state of the world in a word, the top words they use are dangerous, chaotic, mess. So not very optimistic there. But we also asked last week, in fact, what do you consider to be the greatest threat to Britain? And overall, it was cyber attacks that came out on top. But when you broke it down by age, a really interesting pattern emerged, because amongst young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, they were most likely to say nuclear conflict with another country was the greatest risk. So it's clearly very much on the minds of young people.
Faiza, you have a young child.
Oh, God, yeah.
How did you feel when you heard this news this evening?
I mean, I think like a lot of people have just been worried for a while. We have the sorts of people in charge that do have arguments on social media and then come out and start moving nuclear weapons around. I mean, it's really atrocious. It's hard when you've got, young kids. I think, though, in general, we have to understand that international law has broken down. We can see that with Palestine. We can see that with the way Trump behaves. And certainly, I spent a few years in New York, and I worked with a lot of UN ambassadors just when Russia invaded Ukraine. And there was already a sense of kind of the global order changing and kind of a lot of anger at disparities between sort of Western countries broadly and others.
David, this does come at a time of very fragile diplomacy and where we're at in terms of Ukraine and this deadline that Trump's moved forward to next Friday in terms of sanctions and the ultimatums to Russia as well. Does this change things in any way?
I mean, it might do. So I think you have to say, look, this nuclear bluster might be just that alarming nuclear bluster, but there is a potential real-world consequence, which is one of the really interesting developments over the last couple of months, has been Western leaders have finally had some success in trying to peel Donald Trump away from his belief that Ukraine was to blame for its own invasion and that the best end to this war was a peace deal more or less imposed on Ukraine that was massively in Vladimir Putin's favour. And you've seen any number of Western leaders trying to get to Donald Trump and persuade him that when Vladimir Putin refuses to have this ceasefire, he's disrespecting you, Donald. He's not treating you with the respect you deserve. They're trying to play to his psychology, and we know that this is what they're doing because they've told us about it in other interviews. That does, at the moment, seem to have some kind of effect on him. We've seen him recently complaining that he's very disappointed that he'll have a phone call with President Putin, and then just hours later, Putin's drones and missiles are hitting Ukrainian cities and causing what he says is disgusting damage. If that sense that he's being disrespected, that Russia is in fact not a potential friend, means that he delivers more weapon systems to Ukraine, means that he allows more money to flow to Ukraine, and as you mentioned, this potential secondary sanctions. There's a bill sitting in the US Senate with massive support from across the two parties in the Senate, which would potentially put really crippling sanctions on countries like China and India that buy Russian oil. If he allowed that to take place, that would be a complete game changer. But we don't know how that connects to this spat with Medvedev. But if you're Ukraine, you're probably hoping that this anti-Putin impatience carries on a bit longer.
Admiral, what's your view on that sort of impatience that we're now seeing from President Trump towards Putin, expressing his disappointment in the president? Now we're seeing these moves as well this evening. Do you think it could have a knock-on effect in terms of weaponry to Ukraine or any sort of bigger consequences from the sort of irritation that he's now expressing? The fact that he's flip-flopped for months, but now he really seems to be constantly critical of Russia.
Yeah, I do. And I agree the European leaders have helped. But the real driving force in Trump changing his mind is Putin's stubbornness and his refusal to come to heel when Trump tells him to stop firing weapons. Trump fancies himself when Trump.
We can still hear you, Admiral.
Yeah, thank you. When Trump, when Trump fails to, when Putin fails to listen to Trump, it irritates him. So I do think we're coming to a point where more weapons will be transferred. What I'm hoping for are the kind of offensive weapons that give the Ukrainians an opportunity to break up the Russian advances. And then, of course, the sanctions. Both Biden and Trump have had the ability to do secondary sanctions. They haven't taken advantage of the weaker laws they have. The new bill coming from Senator Lindsey Graham that was referenced earlier is exactly the kind of bill that puts overwhelming sanctions on what would eventually be Chinese and Indian recipients of fossil fuel via the shadow fleet from Russia. That's how you break the Russian will in this fight. It's by breaking the Russian economy.
Faisal, can I ask you as an economist, though, how these sanctions would actually work? Because in Russia, they see them as being toothless and a bit meaningless because they think President Trump's is not going to follow through on them. He's not going to risk that in terms of what could happen to markets, in terms of, price of gas going up at the pump for Americans. Do you see them as just being symbolic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot going on that is making things more expensive for the US consumer and consumers around the world with the tariffs that he's already put in place. I think also with these secondary sanctions, it sounds like, of course, India and China have been like middlemen for Russia and they have given them a lifeline in some ways. But actually, this could also backfire because when you feel the kind of anger around the bullying tactics Trump has used on tariffs, on the way he talks to other countries, that in the short term, they might act, but in the long term, in the medium to long term, there's a lot of anger there that's brewing, and I just don't think that this will work out well for Trump ultimately.
What do you think, David, about this deadline of next Friday as well, and whether the threat of secondary sanctions is even real, whether he would follow through on them, because he can veto as well?
Yeah, we've had Putin blow through a lot of deadlines. These secondary sanctions, I think, the reason to be sceptical that he's really willing to unleash devastating economic sanctions on a country like China is that one of the other very disconcerting things going on in the world is that he seems to be ready to do a giant trade deal with China at the same time as he's going around places like Asia telling other countries, don't let China into your supply chains. I need you to help me encircle and choke off China. But he's also clearly signaling he wants to do a giant trade deal with China. So I think you can add this to the very long list of reasons why Trump's willingness to kind of try and play all sides all the time, always guided by the principle of America first, is incredibly difficult for every other country to try and deal with, because they don't know whether they're being told to get tough on China or whether he actually wants to be nice to China and do a giant deal and have a nice visit to China to see his friend Xi Jinping. And so there's a whole bunch of sort of separate ambitions that Donald Trump has in motion, and they don't add up. They often contradict. And I think for a government like the UK trying to work out how to play this moment, what do you do to try and please Donald Trump or stay out of his bad books? It's incredibly difficult because a lot of what he's doing is in contradiction with other things that he has in motion.
We shouldn't assume that the other countries as well won't get fed up and start actually becoming more of an economic group with each other as well. And, those discussions are happening. You see it on things like debt and where they borrow from China more. And so I just think that this level of pushing these countries could completely backfire.
Okay. Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, good to have you with us from Taipei. Have a good weekend. Thank you.